So we are going to be, one more time, a pass through Pergamum. There's just so much data, there's so much information with all of these cities, in particular Pergamum, that as much as we can, we want to connect what John is saying in the book of Revelation to the letter of Pergamum with what's on the ground at Pergamum or what's happening. And what we'll see today is it's not only the book of Revelation, it's also the Gospel of John. As we've noted that when we saw the Asclepius, then you go to the Gospel of John and he heals a man right at a location in Jerusalem where there's an Asclepius. So he includes that story because it speaks to the audience right there at Pergamum. So they're either going to read his Revelation or they're going to read his Gospel. Either one, they're going to be able to recognize something from their culture that's happening right there on the ground in Turkey. So the past few videos, we've gone maybe extendedly, we've kind of brought you into Pergamum. This time I'm going to go a little bit faster. So it's in modern day Turkey, and John is writing the book of Revelation to 7 churches. Now there's those yellow pins on the screen are where the churches are located. And you'll notice there's one extra pin for Colossae because Colossae is right next to Laodicea. When Paul writes his letter to Colossae, read the last chapter. And Paul says, hey, when you're finished with this letter, take it over to Laodicea and share it with them. And oh, by the way, get the letter I wrote to Laodicea and read it yourself. So Paul apparently wrote a letter to Laodicea. We don't have a copy of it. But those are sister cities. They're right next to each other. Okay, we've noted John is in Ephesus. This is where John headquarters himself. He writes the Gospel of John from Ephesus. He writes Revelation. He goes out to an island called Patmos, which is just off the coast there. But then we assume he's writing Revelation somewhere at Ephesus as well and distributes it to the 7 churches. Chapter 1 says to write this letter to the 7 churches of Asia. And then they list in order Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. And those are the 7 churches. They go in a clockwise order, so it's not a random list of cities. That's the important part when we see where they lay on the ground. Okay, we've discussed the past couple weeks Pergamum up to the north. And again, Ephesus is the most dominant city, kind of like Los Angeles in California. Pergamum is like Sacramento. Not a whole lot going on in Sacramento, except that's where the governor sits. Well, that's how Pergamum is. So Pergamum was the seat of the Roman power. We've talked about that last week. And just to give you some scale, it's about 80 miles as the crow flies from Ephesus to Pergamum. So that map is hard to tell distance-wise, but that's 80 miles. So that's going from San Diego to Huntington Beach. It's a pretty good distance if you went as the crow flies again. Okay, let's go closer to Pergamum. Sits in what's called the Caicus River Valley. Not really much there to tell about the geography or that river valley. Really, the main thing as we get closer to Pergamum is the fact that it has an acropolis. Many scholars think as you approach Pergamum from the south, that acropolis looks like a throne. There's a whole bunch of temples on the top. It's flat. It juts out above the ground of the valley floor. Many scholars think somebody, as you approach Pergamum, it looks like a throne, and maybe that's why John's calling it Satan's throne. So maybe there is some geography to talk about. The modern city today is called Bergama, and there you see that just to the southwest. Okay, as we've done week after week, we want to look at 2 things. We want to be able to connect the text of the Old Testament. So in John's day, and Paul, and the rest of the disciples and apostles, our New Testament has not been solidified yet. They're just writing those letters. The Gospels are just being written. They're beginning to circulate. The stories of Jesus are going around. But what they have to do Whenever they argue for Jesus as Messiah, they argue from their Old Testament. That makes me excited because it means they went out and changed the world with just the Old Testament. We want to go change the world with the New Testament, and there's nothing wrong with that, but we got to know our Old Testament because that's how they did it, and if they did it that way, well, we can do it that way too. So we have to have an understanding of both, and that's where my passion for the Old Testament comes in. And then what we want to do is be able to connect that, the words of the Old Testament, to the cultural and historical context. And you've noticed as we've looked at this, you often are butting up against the gods of that world. There's hundreds of gods. In fact, any power you see can become a god, and they don't care if you worship every single one of them. It's no big deal. Where suddenly the Jews living among them were the oddballs. The Jews living among them only worshiped one God, and that made them strange. So now the Christians show up, and they say, oh no, we only worship one God too, and his Messiah, Jesus. So that is you're going to bump right up against that culture when your neighbor says, hey, wait a minute, why aren't you making an offering to Artemis or Kibbalah or Demeter? Because if you don't make an offering to Demeter, she's going to get mad and my crops are going to suffer. So you better start worshiping Demeter. And that creates some tension in the world. Okay, so we want to connect text to context. And what comes out of that, it emerges a message that, bam, impacts them. They know exactly what John's talking about, but we have to know something about each side. Okay, that's important. All right, so we've asked this question the past 3 weeks. Why does John say Satan's throne? I know where you live, where Satan has his throne. He repeats that multiple times. So we want to ask that question. What are the candidates for the one who stands at the face of God or the one who deceives the believers in God and says, nope, that's not really the order that you're looking for. You should follow us. So we want to ask, what are these candidates? So week after week, we've noted, and today we're going to look at this one, the Center for Pagan Worship. As I mentioned last week, 61 different temples they've found, to 61 different gods there in Pergamum. Another book I was reading this week quoted a scholar who thinks that there were more altars or temples in Pergamum than all the other cities combined. So it's chock full of pagan worship. There's the altar to Zeus. We talked about that altar last week, and they call Zeus, of course, is the most high god to them. He's the father of the gods, and they called him Savior, and clearly that's a fraud. You have the Asclepius temple. We did that 2 weeks ago and saw that that's pretty much like a spa-like hospital. It was a famous hospital in the ancient world, and you see their healing and medicine as we took that tour through the Asclepius temple. And of course, he's called the Savior, and he's a healer. And oh, by the way, his symbol is a snake. So maybe he's the reason John calls it Satan's throne. Then last week, we talked about the seat of Roman power. The governor, they call it the proconsul, but the governor who sat at Pergamum had the power of the sword, called us gladii, the use or the right of the sword. And when you have the right of the sword, you control the power over life and death. And John says, oh, no, you don't. I saw the one who holds the sword with the two edges. It's Jesus. He controls the power over life and death, not you. And don't get confused. Then the last thing, the imperial cult. We talked about this a little bit over the past 2 weeks, but what I'm going to do next week is we're going to go through some of the stuff on the imperial cult, because Pergamum is a center for the imperial cult, and so is Ephesus. But I just want to explain some reasons why scholars believe that the imperial cult, the worship of the Caesar as God, is why John calls it Satan's throne. We'll do that next week. Okay, so this week we're going to go here one more time. I'll show you two things. One of them is a god named Dionysus, and what we're going to do is connect the Dionysus worship with the Old Testament, Balaam and Balak. So hopefully you had a chance this week to read over Balaam and Balak, so I'm not just throwing names at you that are abstract. All right. What they found in Pergamum is an altar to a god that was unknown. Now, this picture was taken inside the temple to Demeter. Demeter is the goddess of groceries. She's in Roman called Ceres, where we get cereal from. So somebody brought this altar and dumped it inside the temple of Demeter. It's an altar to an unknown god. So of all their gods that they have altars and temples to, they even had one that they're just not sure who it might be. Now, where do we see a reference to the altar of the unknown god? Well, it comes in our New Testament in the book of Acts. So in Acts, if you have your Bible, you can go ahead and open to Acts 17, 22 to 23. And this is a discussion that Paul is going to have with some of the people in Athens. So he's moving through Greece now, and he's going through Athens, and he begins to have a conversation, and it goes something like this. Then Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" Now, apparently, there's only 3 altars to the unknown God that they've ever found. One in Athens, one in Pergamum, and I'm not sure where the other one is, but it was noted that there were only 3 of these, one of them in Pergamum. Now, why? What are they doing? Well, the story goes something like there had been a plague. A plague showed up within the people, and they start, going and making offerings to all their gods, trying to appease the god who's angry. And apparently, none of them worked. So they assumed, well, there's got to be another god out there that we're just not sure who it is. And so they set up an altar to an unknown god, and whenever something bad in the world would happen, and you didn't know exactly who was causing it, you'd go make sacrifices to an unknown god, because you have to sacrifice something in order to stop whatever's happening. There's another thing they noted. Scholars have noted that they viewed the Jewish God as an unknown God because you're not allowed to make an image of him. All the other gods have an image, and they look just like human beings. So you get to the Jewish God, though, not allowed to have an image of that. So it's an unknown God. You can't see him. Anyways, so I just wanted to show you that something in Pergamum connects to Paul in Athens. Now, notice the next sentence. Paul, so you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. That's how Paul wins friends and influences people, right? By calling them ignorant. So you're ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. And then if you read the rest of Acts, Paul goes on to say, I know the God of the world. I know the God who created the world. I also know that he appointed a judge over the world. And that's, of course, Jesus. It's so cool to watch Paul. You have to pay attention. When Paul is talking to a group of people in Athens who don't know the Bible, he never quotes the Bible. He says, I know the God who created the world. I know the person he's appointing over to be judge. And oh, by the way, he resurrected him from the dead. Now, none of that is technically from the Bible because we've seen all the gods, or not all the gods, many of the gods resurrect. So Paul is speaking to their culture. When he goes to a synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia, it's one Old Testament text after the other. Abraham and Moses and David, and you guys are stiff-necked people, and it's all from the Old Testament because his audience knows the Old Testament. So again, he's speaking to an audience in a way that they would understand exactly what Paul is saying. All right, I just wanted to show you that altar because it's kind of cool. It picks up somewhere in Acts, and You know, you don't get to see those things every day. Okay, here's where we're going to spend most of our time today. This is a god that does have a name and does have a statue and was worshipped widely, Dionysus. So Dionysus is the god of theater and a whole bunch more. We'll talk about that. Here is a picture of the Acropolis. Now, I showed you this last week. It just looks like a brown hill with some buildings on it. But let me show you, just to give you a little tour. That tree right there is where the Zeus temple is. So we've seen that picture of the Zeus temple over and over again that has that tree growing out. That's the Zeus temple. Where we're going to go today is right there in the center, that theater, that amphitheater built into the side of the hill. And, they're pretty smart people. The wind comes off of the sea behind you, right? So as you're speaking on the stage, if you have a slight breeze, like we get the breeze off the Pacific, it'll help carry your voice up into that amphitheater. So it faces, the person speaking would have the wind at their back, let's say. And then where we're going to go is right next to that theater is a temple. You can barely see it jutting out of the ground, but I put a circle around it. That's the temple to Dionysus. And so Dionysus is connected to the theater. In fact, the sanctuary you worship Dionysus is the theater. That is the theater right there. Now, it's hard to get scale. Again, I'll show you a couple pictures, but they just don't do justice to how big that thing is. The altar to Zeus right there on the corner, overlooking the valley below. You have, of course, the theater right there. And then down here, you can see there's a path that leads through, and you'll eventually get to the temple of Dionysus. Let me show you a different picture of this. It's kind of a wonky picture, but I wanted to capture the whole thing. Here's the Zeus altar. You have the theater right there in the side of the hill. And then right down there, that building, it's just the outline of a building. That's the temple to Dionysus. I'll show you another picture in a second. The stage was placed up on stilts so that you could walk underneath the stage to get to Dionysus, to make your offering, to offer some incense, whatever it was. But you're walking through the theater. They could also remove the stage because in the Dionysus procession, just like they do in many cultures today, they take a statue and they process the statue around. So they'll take the statue out of that temple and they'll go on a big procession, kind of like many cultures during the Pentecost will have a celebration where you're carrying a statue. Okay, there's the theater. Let's talk a little bit about theater. This theater and then theater in general. They're not exactly sure when the total theater was built. It's probably built in stages, but it's pretty old, 300 to 250 BC. So it could have been planted by Lysimachus. That's a name I gave you a couple weeks ago. He was one of the generals from Alexander the Great. So Lysimachus could have been the one who started the theater. Other scholars say, no, Eumenes the first. So either one, it's an old theater. That's the point. 250 BC. And probably, just like anything in life, they added to it as their technology and building got better. It's the steepest theater in the world. I'll show you in a picture, even though, again, it's tough to exactly appreciate how steep that is, but it's the steepest theater in the world, and they say it seats 12,000. I don't know how they do that. 12,000 small people, maybe. So there's the theater again. Let me show you a picture from the top. So we're looking down, and it's very hard to tell how steep that is. The theater actually has a curve to it, like a convex curve. So as you're looking down, it actually gets steeper at the bottom. So it's bent. There is a curve to it. This is the stage. And of course, the orchestra pit sits in front of it. And it's remarkable. If someone stands in the orchestra pit and talks, you can hear them, but it's muffled. you go back to the stage and stand where the stage is, you can hear them much clearer. It's pretty cool. Okay, so seats 12,000. So the history of theater, I'm not an expert in the history of theater, but this is what I've read about and was told on the trip that I took. You have a gentleman by the name of Thespis. And Thespis took a story called the Dithyramb. The Dithyramb is the story of Dionysus. So you're telling the story of the god Dionysus. Thespis, where we get the phrase thespians, was considered like the father of plays. So he creates a play, the story of Dionysus, and that immediately now connects the Dionysus to the theater. So every year at the Dionysus festival, you would have a play put on that would celebrate the story of Dionysus, kind of like a Christmas pageant at your church. Same idea. You're gonna retell the story of the god. So that's where it gets started. And of course, that's why when you go to this theater, you have to say, where's Dionysus to the theater? Okay, let's go take a look now. So right down in that corner, if you go down there, now this is the tough part for those of you who have been there, or if you've explored any ancient site, you take a picture and it's just a bunch of rocks laying around. But the reason I took this picture is that's the altar. So you can see that's a square altar. So you would have brought your sacrifice to Dionysus. That would have been the altar that you sacrificed on. If I turned around, this is what it looks like. That's the steps leading up to the temple of Dionysus. Now, again, doesn't look like much, but let me show you the artist's rendering. This is at Pergamum. It's on the sign as you're walking into the place. So you can see there on the left, that's what the artist's rendering would have looked like of the steps leading up to and that temple. It's very small. So unlike Artemis, which was over at, or Kibbalah, which was over at Sardis, the Dionysus temples are quite small. So they recognize the temple is not the place that you hold your worship service. The temple is the place that you keep the statue to Dionysus. You hold your worship service over in the theater. And just so you know, those of you who've been to Bet Shan in Israel, there's a Dionysus temple, very small, in Bet Shan. So the theater at Bet Shan in Israel would have been the place where you celebrate. You put on the Dithyramb, the story of Dionysus. So it even got as far as Israel. Okay, so there's our theater again. So now we have to understand a little bit about Dionysus. Who's this god? And what's the celebration? Well, he's the god of the grape harvest, of wine making, fertility. Now, if you stop right there, the moment you mix a fertility god with wine, you know it's not going to be good. He's the god of ritual madness, religious ecstasy, and of course, theater. He is also a god of resurrection, renewal, and transformation. Now, why? Why do they pick him? Well, because what happens every year with the grapes and the grapevines? Well, every fall, the grapevines suffer and die. They go into a period that they look like they're dead, and suddenly in the spring, they come back to life. So there's resurrection and renewal. Now, we'll see in his myth that he's resurrected, but it's partly because they're watching nature. It's also transformation. How do you get a grape that isn't wine into wine? Well, something transforms it. What's that power? Dionysus. Okay, so you have to always go back and look at the myth. And these myths are often, the early church fathers are saying, this is why John's calling it Satan's throne. It's a complete fraud of Jesus. So the first thing about the myth of Dionysus is just like Asclepius, he's born of union between a god, Zeus, and a mortal woman, Semele. Now, the gods are always interacting with human beings, even in sexual ways. If you go back to Genesis 6, the sons of God were coming down from heaven and interacting with the women. And that's a very mysterious passage in Genesis 6, but it's very old, this idea that the sons of God would come down into earth and have relations. He's resurrected from the dead. So the story goes, Zeus got Semele pregnant, and Zeus's wife Hera got really mad. And so she killed Semele, and then Zeus took Dionysus, put him in his thigh, and like a womb, the thigh, he gestated Dionysus, and Dionysus is born again. So he's technically raised from the dead by Zeus. And then what happened to Dionysus was he went out into the mountains and he lived with some old folks that taught him winemaking, vineyards. And he becomes the god of the vine. He becomes the one who's able to transform a grape to wine, fermentation. So he's a god of transformation. He wants to transform you, but we have to ask, well, how does he transform you? That's the important piece. Okay, continuing on with Dionysus, he's a god of epiphany, meaning he shows up and goes away mysteriously. So they always want Dionysus to show up. So they celebrate him coming into town or his arrival. Part of this goes to the idea that if you're seeking this religious ecstasy in a party, you're always seeking it. You don't know when it's going to show up. You're never sure. And it's an arrival that shows up and you say, Dionysus is here. We didn't see him coming. But he's a god of epiphany. You celebrate his arrival. He's a god of transformation. I mentioned that, grapes to wine, but also for youth. So when the youth are growing up and transition from youth to adult, you go through the stage of celebrating Dionysus in your transition. He's the god of party, drunkenness, ritual madness, and ecstasy. And you transform to be like the god by ingesting wine. We call it spring break. I take that back. We call it Mardi Gras. So Dionysus, when he got taken to Rome, he's called Bacchus. And a Bacchanalia is a festival to Dionysus. Well, Mardi Gras is a Bacchanalia. And if you know Mardi Gras and you read about Dionysus, you'll say, my goodness, they're still doing the same thing. And there are people who worship the trip to go celebrate Mardi Gras. And what are you doing? You get drunk. There's ritual madness. It turns into debauchery. And you're not going there to Mardi Gras to find wholesomeness. There's the people who go worship Mardi Gras are looking for the same thing. You want to be transformed. Instead of wine, maybe at Mardi Gras, it's drinking a hurricane. But either way, the idea is the same. Now, the process of transformation, this gets really important. How do we transform to be like Dionysus? Or how did they celebrate that process? Well, first of all, you're going to ingest the spirit of the god through wine and also raw meat. Now, the animal, Dionysus, is a bull, so you would ingest raw bull meat. But by drinking wine, the wine fills you up with the spirit of the god. Why do we call alcohol spirits? Right? It comes from the very old idea of that the spirit of the god is now working in you through the alcohol. So the wine fills you with the spirit of God and you transform to become more like Dionysus. And he's not you don't want to transform to be like Dionysus. Well, some people do, but you don't want to. Now, think about this. If the idea of drinking wine, which of course leads to drunkenness, is what they do in a Dionysus celebration, check out what Paul says. Now, on your sheet, I got this wrong. I put Ephesians 6:18. It's actually Ephesians 5:18 and 19. But listen to the words of Paul as he's writing to Ephesus, only 80 miles down the road. He says this, "Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit." Now that is right there to the practices around Dionysus that they assume that the wine fills them with the spirit of Dionysus. Paul says, no, don't do that. Be filled with the Spirit of God. And also, Dionysus festival is all about music and partying. So look what Paul keeps saying. Speak to one another with psalms and hymns and songs from the Spirit. Don't sing those awful songs of Dionysus. Sing and make music from your heart to the Lord. So he's got a celebratory tone to it, but he's also saying, don't go into that type of celebration. And considering that's written in the letter to Ephesus, they would clearly be able to see Dionysus inside of something like that. That would be a cultural thing they'd pick up on. Okay, let's keep going. Now, every year, you have a festival to Dionysus in the spring. So it's a springtime festival because you're celebrating the fact that your grapes are now coming back alive. The grapevines are going to come back and produce more wine this year, which means Dionysus is active in the grapes. Now, here's a word that we're going to, especially next week, we'll talk about this word. It's neochorus. So Pergamum was neochorus to Dionysus. Now, what does neochorus mean? Well, neochorus is an idea of a temple keeper. So if you want to know, let's say you want to set up a Dionysus temple in another city. Where do you learn how to do all the worship of Dionysus? You go to Pergamum. Because they're the temple keeper. They're the ones who keep the religion and the worship in order. They're the central location for Dionysus worship. If you see, in our Protestant faith, Protestants don't have a neochorus. Protestants are all over the place, right? Everybody, we divide into little groups. You know, maybe at one point the Lutheran neochorus was in Germany somewhere. The Catholic Church, they have a neochorus. It's Rome. So whenever the Catholic Church wants to make a decision, it goes all the way up to the Pope in Rome, and Rome is like the temple keeper. I don't mean that derogatory. I mean, that's where you learn about the Catholic faith, or where decisions about the Catholic faith are made, is at the main central location. That's neochorus. So Pergamum being neochorus to Dionysus means thousands of people would travel every year from the surrounding areas to come in and worship at Pergamum. Huge. It's like New Orleans at Mardi Gras. We could say that New Orleans is neochorus for Mardi Gras. The festival to Dionysus, one of the things that marked it was that the female followers of Dionysus, they're called Maenads, and that means the raving ones. So Dionysus basically gave you a religious reason to go out and party and be wild. And the women, who normally would not be allowed to go out and act this way, are given free license during this week. And we call it spring break today, because it's the same thing that happens at spring break or at Mardi Gras. It's like all the rules go out the window. So what you get, it's a very sexual festival because of everything that's happening with Dionysus. All right, so let's say there's thousands of people packed into this theater. We watched the play of Dionysus, and now we're going to pull the statue out, and we're going to parade him around the city. So you parade out of the city. You can see that path called the Sacred Way. That path goes out, and as you turn the corner, you're going to start getting into buildings. You move away from the temple and the theater, and you start getting into whether it's houses or, as I'll show you, it's like a banquet hall, a restaurant of sorts where you're going to worship Dionysus. So you process out of there, and you'll end up at a place. This is at least one of them that they've found. Obviously doesn't look like much, just a bunch of stones laying on the ground. But notice something that's built into the ground right here and right there. It's about the size of a 55-gallon drum, and it's a wine vat. You sink the wine vat down into the ground to help regulate the temperature. And they note that this is not just a store that sells wine, it's a restaurant that serves wine. So you have this huge vat that sits down. Let me give you a couple other pictures here. So there's the vat there. There's the second one there. And when the archaeologists went to the bottom of the vat, they found grape residue or wine residue. Here's a picture. I put my foot in it just to show you the size of it. That's a fairly large container. That pottery is quite thick. And this altar, they found inscriptions to Dionysus. So they know that this altar was inside the room. Inside that room is some kind of worship of Dionysus is going to take place. Now here's the main part of the banquet hall. When you go to the banquet, you're going to lie down on something that's called a triclinium. Now, many of you have seen a triclinium. If you've been to the Herodian in Israel, there's a huge triclinium. Herod put a massive triclinium in the Herodian, and by the way, the Jews turned it into a synagogue, but that doesn't matter. A triclinium is a place to celebrate a festival. Jesus and his disciples reclined at Passover. They're at a triclinium. So a triclinium is just like it sounds, tricline. It's a three-sided. So here's one side, two sides, three sides. You can see right above those circles with the numbers, you have a bar. Your bar would be here. Someone would come up and serve you. They would set your drink or your food on that bar. You can see in the corner these steps right here. There's some steps. There's some steps. Steps over here and steps over here. That's how you get up onto the triclinium. Then you climb up there and you lay down. You lay down leaning on your left side. And someone's going to come over and they're going to give you wine. And in celebration of Dionysus, they're going to bring you some raw meat and blood. Now, right there, the moment John shows up into Pergamum and someone swings him around, gives him a tour and says, oh yeah, what happens in here? You immediately can see the look on a Jewish person's face. What are you forbidden to do in the Old Testament? Eat any meat with blood in it. So you're given raw meat and blood. They note that this makes many people sick. That's part of the worship. So you can see how wholesome that is. Let's go worship Dionysus and then get sick because we ingested raw meat and blood. These they found all over Pergamum. So this is where the worship happens. So I want to show you something. As you leave there, you're drunk, you're filled with the Spirit, and then everything descends into, well, you can imagine what it descends into. So the festival of Dionysus is marked by eating raw meat, flesh that represents the god, and drinking blood, and that way you become one with the god. So it's a way of ingesting the god into you so that you become one. Now let me just show you something, and I'm watching the clock, so I'm not going to give you time to turn there, but you can look at it later. Notice it's John writing Revelation. John's the pastor to these churches that all know Dionysus. Notice in the book of John, it's chapter 6, 53 to 58, and I know everybody's probably had a tough time with this. Jesus says to them, very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, You have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise them up at the last day. That's tough. But I want you to notice something. Clearly, Jesus is in metaphor here. He's in metaphor. He's not saying, I want you to literally eat my flesh and drink my blood. It's metaphor. But notice, it's not just drink blood. Whose blood? My blood. Unless you eat my flesh and my blood. And so it's not about, he's speaking directly against Dionysus. Verse 55, my flesh is real food. My blood is real drink. The emphasis is on whose. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood. Notice how many times he's repeating that in this very little sentence. But you can see if you're sitting in Pergamum and you're reading John's gospel, you get to this part, that's direct refute of Dionysus. Whoever eats my flesh, drinks my blood, remains in me, and I in them. It's a transformative substance. So notice also that he starts to go down and explain it. Verse 58, this is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. So Jesus is, it's obvious metaphor, and of course, when you get to the Last Supper, he's going to integrate that with what we know today as our Eucharist or the communion. But the idea of Eucharist and communion, it's a very old religious idea that says, I want the substance, if I ingest a substance, it will transform me. So part of the communion is the ingestion of this bread represents my flesh, this wine represents my blood. We ingest that and you become communed in a sense with the God. And there's also covenantal things in there as well, but part of that, and Jesus wants you to then transform into his likeness. So that's another, it speaks to the culture. Let's put it that way. At Capernaum, where John says, this took place, right across the Sea of Galilee is a city called Hippos. And at Hippos, you also have Dionysus worship. And then you also have Pan worship. That's the god from Caesarea Philippi. And so it's very close to where Jesus is speaking when he says this. I want to make the point, though, it's about the process of what happens when you begin to worship Jesus and in the metaphor of ingesting flesh and blood. Which direction do you transform? That's what I want to know. Do you transform into healing? Do you experience more peace? Do you strengthen through the power of the Holy Spirit? Do you become more whole? It's the direction that when you're worshiping Jesus, you're going in that direction. If you go Dionysus, what direction are you going? You're going the exact opposite. When you worship Dionysus, it's drunkenness, sickness. There's demeaning things happen at the Dionysus festivals. You experience shame afterwards, even though you're seeking out some religious experience in the moment because you want to be transformed and lifted up. The drudgery of the day is getting heavy, and you want something to lift your spirits, so to speak. But what it does is it leaves you wanting. It leaves you empty. And so part of the point of this, what I think Jesus is saying is, it's me. When you come to me and worship me in this way, I'll lift you up. And, oh, by the way, I'll strengthen you. I'll reinforce your humanity. You'll become more whole. I'll heal you. It's not demeaning. You don't experience shame. It's all the things that it's about our humanity, that what happens when we worship that God. The real power in this, to me, is that I came from the Dionysus side. Me. I came from that side. I wasn't a Christian growing up. I didn't become a Christian until 30. And what was I doing in my 20s? Well, I was trying to go to Mardi Gras. I lived in Pensacola, Florida. We would go to Mardi Gras every year because all the guys that I hung out with, I mean, I lived with 5 guys in a house. We would all get in the car and go to Mardi Gras as we're trying to have these party experiences. Or you'd constantly be searching out where's the best bar to go to have the most fun. So I lived the Dionysus worship. I didn't know anything about God, and I didn't want to know anything about God. And so the most powerful way that you can speak to an audience like this is to have come from there. It's a personal testimony that says, I was blind, but now I see. God lifted me up out of the muck and the mud and all the crud that I thought was supposed to bring me happiness in life, but kept bringing me more sorrow. So I want you to know, for me, there's real truth and power in Jesus' words, not because he simply said it and it's a static fact, but because when you put it into practice, you become more like the person God intended you to become. More like a little Jesus. You transform. There is transformational power in Jesus. You have to ingest it in a way and become one with him, and you become more Christ-like. And I can, from the bottom of my heart, if you worship Dionysus, it's not going to end well, and it never does. And so I just say that as coming from that place. And there's real power in Jesus. I can remember very early on as a Christian feeling as if my soul was being re-knit together. That God was giving me the strength. And it wasn't just intellectual or anything. It was my soul was being put back together. Okay, sorry for that rant. But there's real power in this. When somebody says, I used to be a Dionysus follower and now I'm not. And I can tell you the other side is much better. Okay, so a Dionysus festival. What is the whole idea? Well, you eat meat sacrificed to idols. That's from Revelation. And you commit sexual immorality. It's all over. It's Mardi Gras. That's the focus. So when we go back to Revelation 2, 14 to 16, and you read John's words, listen to what he's saying. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you. There are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin. And what was their sin? They ate food sacrificed to idols. Now that word food, if you dig deeper into the Greek word that they're using, is often idol meat. So you could say they ate meat sacrificed to idols and committed sexual immorality. That's directly against Dionysus. They would all hear it because that's the Dionysus festival. Now, we have to know something, though. What are they talking about in that Old Testament? So there's some things we have to review. Likewise, you have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. We'll talk about that in a minute. Repent, therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you, and I will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. He's pulling something from the Old Testament, but we have to understand what is going on in the Old Testament. So let's go there. Balaam and Balak. We're not going to read the text because it's just too long. There's too many chapters. But the story of Balaam and Balak shows up. Balak is the king of Moab. The Israelites are coming to enter into the promised land, and the king of Moab, he's not real happy about it, so he wants to curse them. So he says, hey, go send for Balaam. Balaam is a prophet, and he says, hey, I want you to curse the Israelites. And Balaam keeps saying, look, I can only say what God tells me to say. So every time he goes to try to curse them, he ends up blessing the Israelites. And Balak, of course, is getting frustrated because, hey, what am I paying you for? You're supposed to curse them. And what's happening is you keep blessing them. Okay? So you'd think that everything is going to end well, right? So if we look at this story, if you haven't read it, go back and read it again. It's in the book of Numbers, chapter 22 to 24. Now that's Balaam and Balak. That's the whole discussion. And when you get to the end of chapter 24, it sounds like, hey, I can't curse the Israelites. Everything's going to end well. But that's not what happens. When you get to chapter 25, the very first verse of chapter 25 says this: when Israel was staying at Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality. The women invited them to sacrifices to their God, and the people ate the sacrificial meal. Now, what happened? How did we get from Balaam can't curse and only blesses Israel to the very next chapter, they're involved in sexual immorality and eating meals, the sacrificial meal? What took place? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us. How did we end up like this? How did they end up committing sexual immorality and worshiping their gods? The Bible doesn't tell us. Now, any fifth grader in Bible school, in Hebrew school, is going to ask their rabbi, Rabbi, tell me, how did we go from getting blessings from Balaam to committing sexual immorality? What happened? And what developed over time is a story that explains the situation. It's called midrash. Midrash is a way to explain something in the Bible that's not explicitly said. Jesus tells parables. Parables are a midrash. Now, how do we know this? Well, the midrash is recorded in Josephus. So if you read the historian Josephus, he records this extended story of a discussion that happened. And you're thinking, where did Josephus get this? Well, it's just they're filling in the blanks. Now, we're not going to read it. It's quite extended, but let me give you the paraphrase summary. Josephus says this: after Balaam couldn't curse the Israelites, he ends up going over to Balak and he says, look, God won't let me curse them. But I'll tell you what, you can trick them into cursing themselves. Oh yeah? How do we do that? Well, Balaam says to Balak, get all your attractive women, get them dressed up in their fine clothes, send them out to start interacting with the Israelite men, and they'll be feeding out of their hands in moments. And what they'll do is you can trick them into committing their own sin, devolving into that sin. Now that, again, that's not in the Bible, but if we notice the words of John, that's exactly what John says. So that comes from Josephus. It's also in Philo, another first century writer. So you can read that whole thing, but it's just a story that says there was a conversation and they tricked the Israelites. Oh no, go ahead, hang out with the women, you'll be fine. Well, that totally fits the Dionysus story too. So let's go, if you look back at Revelation 2, there are some among you who hold to the teaching of Balaam, and you think, well, what teaching is that? Well, it's that midrash. It's the one we find in Josephus, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin so that they ate food, sacrificed to idols, and committed sexual immorality. And that speaks, bam, right to. So the idea is there were some in the community who were saying to the Christians, don't worry about Dionysus. Go ahead, celebrate the Dionysus festival. It's no big deal. Because remember, if you come from a culture that worships any god you want with no problem, well, then you would tell someone else, yeah, it's no big deal. Yeah, go to Mardi Gras. Nothing bad will happen. You know, it's kind of like you're enticing them to go out and then to possibly fall into sin. Then he says this, likewise, you also have those who hold to the teachings of the Nicolaitans. Now that's one that that people wrestle with. Who were these Nicolaitans? And I just want to show you one idea about the Nicolaitans and why they're connected to Balaam. That's important. So long ago, scholars recognized that the names are connected. So Nicolaitan, it comes from the word Nico, which is victory or conquer. The god Nike is a god of victory. So it comes from the word Nico. Nico Laos. Now you could translate it to conquer the people. So that Nikolaos is a conqueror of the people. Well, what's Balaam? Well, the verb bala is to devour or conquer. And bala, is people. So is people. So you can see, some scholars think that John's not talking about necessarily one guy named Nicholas who taught this, but the idea that anybody who teaches you to go outside the bounds of worshiping one God is just like Balaam. And in the Greek, you would call it Nicolaitan or Nicholas. So you could call the Nicolaitans victory over the people or conqueror of the people or conquer the people. And Balaam, the same thing, devour the people or conquer the people. So it seems that there's a connection. He's connecting, obviously, Balaam and the Nicolaitans. But it derives from that name. Okay, one last thing. It goes back to the Old Testament because John is just it's so cool what John does. You have this whole sentence, therefore some of you hold to the teaching of Balaam who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin. Down at the bottom it says, repent therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you. And then it says, I will fight them. Now who's them? Well, it's those who are teaching others to enticing them to sin. It's those who are like Balaam. So he says, I will fight them with the sword. Now, where's John getting that material? Well, the Old Testament, of course. So look at right here, Numbers 31, 7-8. He says, they fought against Midian, as the Lord commanded Moses. They killed every man. Among their victims were Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. And then look at this last little detail that just kind of gets thrown into the sentence in Numbers. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, that's Balaam. And how did they kill him? With the sword. That's from Numbers. So John's pulling the whole story. Even I will come and fight against them with the sword of my mouth. One thing I want to impress, I think right now we live in a very Greek world. Now, we don't call it worshiping Dionysus anymore, but spring break, Mardi Gras, it's all about the worship of the party. It's still, at least the idea is still alive today. And so when you go out into the world, especially as, kids are growing up, teenagers to go to college, to go on to become adults, that transformational period, you have to have a community of people that aren't going to entice you into going to Mardi Gras, that aren't going to entice you into sin or entice you into the temptation of sin. It speaks so loudly to the world we live in and the many temptations that are out there for people who don't have God and are just seeking some kind of religious experience, even if we don't call it a religious experience. That's Pergamum Part 3. All right, next week, let me just tell you what we're going to do next week. We're going to look between Pergamum and Ephesus and only talk about the emperor worship. Why is that emperor worship so important to understand?